Welcome back. Today we're looking at the Eastern Horn of Africa, so Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, that whole IG-80 region. And there's this really stark paradox. You have a place with immense resources, right? Huge potential, livestock, water, and yet it's just constantly deeply mired in food crises, and it seems to only get worse. And our deep dive today, it really digs into how this isn't just about bad weather. It's a failure driven by these wild climate swings, but also by deep structural problems. Think about the climate whiplash they've had. Between 2020 and 2022, you had this La Nina event, 4 straight failed rainy seasons. I mean, the worst drought recorded in 70 years. And then almost instantly, that flipped into these devastating massive floods in 2023, 2024. It's relentless. Looking back since 2010, they've had 8 failed rainy seasons. 8!
Yeah, and what's really key here, what the analysis hammers home, is that this volatility, it isn't just random chaos. These events are tied to big, predictable ocean patterns. Things like the El Nino cycle, the Indian Ocean dipole. We can actually forecast these. Climate change isn't making it random. It's just cranking up the volume, making these predictable swings far more destructive. The sources argue it's less natural disaster, more like structured catastrophe. Physics meaning really bad policy. So our mission here is basically a forensic analysis. We need to connect the dots. How have decades of policy, of history, turned these climate shifts into such persistent, widespread human suffering?
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with that immediate shock, the drought, then the floods.
Yeah.
What does the data show about the human cost of that rapid shift?
Well, the immediate cost is just staggering. The recent floods, the 2023-24 ones, they hit urban and river areas hardest, which tells you something about how vulnerability is shifting as people move. But the drought before that, 2020 to 2023, in Somalia alone, 7.8 million people affected. That's nearly half the population, 46% needing urgent help. And Kenya, just as bad. By 2023, 6.4 million people needing humanitarian aid. That's the highest figure they've seen in at least 10 years. We're talking about basic survival systems failing. 95% of their water pans just dried up. People were forced to walk between 8.6 and 17.6 kilometers just for water.
That's almost, a 38% increase in how far they had to walk, just for water.
Exactly. It pushes coping mechanisms way past the breaking point.
And you see this pressure spilling over into social breakdown, don't you? The sources mentioned Ethiopia.
Yeah, in Ethiopia, the drought wasn't just hitting the usual arid areas. It spread right into conflict zones. And the research directly links this climate failure as, a major factor in a reported surge in child marriages in 2022. Like a 264% increase in the Somali region alone.
Wow. So is the analysis saying climate causes child marriage, or is it more like the final straw, the thing that removes the last few options people have?
It's definitely the latter. Climate shocks strip away livelihoods, economic options vanish, and people are forced into desperate choices. And this gets amplified by rapid urbanization. When rural life collapses because of drought, people flood into towns looking for help.
Right.
Take Kenya's Garissa County. Settlements there reported over 205,000 new arrivals, all looking for goods, services, support, things the local infrastructure just wasn't designed to handle. So this rapid, unplanned movement driven by climate, it just makes the hazard worse.
Okay, so that context, people moving en masse, total reliance on nature. That brings us to the next layer, doesn't it? Why the modern economy there is so fragile, so vulnerable to these hits.
Exactly. The foundation is already weak. You've got chronic poverty, anywhere from 16 to 50% living on less than $2 a day. And critically, 70% of the rural population depends directly on rain-fed agriculture, climate-sensitive systems. That level of exposure, it means even a small climate blip can become a huge crisis.
And those internal weaknesses got absolutely hammered by global shocks recently, especially the region's dependence on imports.
About a third of their average cereal consumption is wheat, and a massive 84% of that wheat is imported, mostly from places like Ukraine and Russia.
So when that conflict started.
Exactly. The cost of importing wheat shot up by 33% in Kenya alone. It was like pouring gasoline on inflation. Hyperinflation hit 15.5% across the region by late 2023. In Ethiopia, it peaked between 30 and 35%. Just crippling.
And on top of that, fuel prices nearly doubled. So the cost of just moving whatever food you could get, it became astronomical. Plus, you had other countries panicking, imposing food export bans to protect their own supplies, which basically just strangled the supply lines for this region that desperately needed those imports.
So external shocks hitting already brittle internal systems. What else makes those internal systems so weak? What other factors are at play?
Well, internally, there are just no shock absorbers. Social safety nets are weak or non-existent. Farmers have very limited access to credit, so they can't invest in adapting. Some areas rely too heavily on just one thing, like tourism. And then there's the ongoing impact of conflict, which constantly damages roads, irrigation, basic infrastructure.
Right.
When you stack all that up, a moderate climate shock doesn't just mean a bad harvest. It can mean famine.
But, okay, to really get why this pattern just keeps repeating, decade after decade, why it seems so hard to adapt or recover, we have to go deeper than just recent economics. We need to look at the history, the foundations. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, the historical context is crucial, isn't it? The analysis really stresses that pre-colonial Africa, generally speaking, was food secure. Scarcity happened, but it was usually temporary. They had systems built on diversity, mobility, adaptation. Resilience was part of the design.
Absolutely. Then colonialism came in and systematically dismantled those systems. It created this deep structural dependency that we're still seeing the fallout from today. The whole agricultural focus was shifted, often forcibly, towards exports. Land and labor were redirected to grow things like long staple cotton, groundnuts, stuff you couldn't eat instead of food for local people.
Well, coercion was built in. Colonial taxes, for instance, often had to be paid in the colonial currency, which you could only get by selling cash crops. Or sometimes, like the hut tax in Sierra Leone, you could literally pay it in cotton. It basically shoved traditional farmers into the cash crop market, whether it met their family's food needs or not. And at the same time, it created these awful debt cycles. There was this cash advance system for crops. Interest rates could hit 50%, sometimes even 200%.
200% interest.
Right.
That's not economics, that's just debt creation.
Designed to trap people, right? To kill off self-sufficiency and those traditional ways of coping. It sounds like they didn't just redirect the economy, they actively destroyed the local food safety net.
Precisely. And that legacy didn't just disappear with independence in the 60s. Many post-independence governments actually continued that focus on exports, often neglecting their own domestic food production. The sources highlight this really startling fact. Sub-Saharan Africa is the only region globally where boosting export crops actually led to a fall in food production per person.
A fall while exporting more. Yeah, more exports, less food per capita. It's backwards.
And then enter the IMF. Those structural adjustment policies, the SAPs, in the 80s and 90s, they seem to have just poured fuel on the fire.
Absolutely.
The economic rules they imposed basically forced governments to slash spending on the very things that build resilience: health, education, local infrastructure. And at the same time, those policies threw the doors wide open for huge foreign land acquisitions. Estimates go up to, 230 million hectares across Africa, often pushing out small farmers who were growing food to make way for more export crops. It cemented that fragility.
It's a foundation built on extraction, really, not on building internal strength.
So faced with all the climate shocks, the economic fragility, this historical weight, how do you even begin to build resilience? Is the capacity there?
Well, yes and no. The analysis shows that actually the capacity for disaster readiness often exists. Countries like Kenya and Ethiopia, they have advanced forecasting systems, multi-agency response teams. The science is there. But, and this is the key failure, the links between getting that early warning and actually acting on it in time are consistently weak, usually because of limited funding or because political priorities lie elsewhere.
Right. Which points to the core policy problem. The focus stays stuck on reacting to disasters after they happen, expensive short-term responses instead of tackling the long-term root causes. The research mentions things like zoning laws, environmental regulations. They exist on paper, but weak enforcement, often tied up with, vested interests, political connections, corruption. It just renders them toothless.
Yeah. So the analysis proposes some very specific systemic solutions to try and break that cycle. First, a fundamental shift in farming itself. Really embracing climate-smart agriculture. Things like drip irrigation, harvesting rainwater, shifting to crops that are genuinely drought-resistant. Second, diversifying the economy is vital. You can't have everyone relying on vulnerable farming. Promoting things like rural tourism, local manufacturing. It reduces that dependence. And third, strengthening the local system. That means serious investment in local markets, in food processing, in storage facilities, all designed to cut down that dangerous reliance on imports. And of course, bolstering social safety nets, reliable food aid, cash transfers for the most vulnerable.
And running through all of that, the sources talk about agroecology, which sounds like more than just farming techniques.
Exactly. Agroecology is presented as this integrating approach. It connects ecology, culture, economics, society, aiming for farming systems that are biodiverse, that are resilient, that use resources efficiently. It's really an acknowledgement that the old industrial high-input model of agriculture just doesn't fit the reality, the climate, the social structures of the IGD region. You need something truly adapted to the place.
So let's try and synthesize this deep dive. What's the core takeaway?
The core finding, really, is that the terrible impacts we're seeing from climate disasters in the Horn of Africa, they're not just bad luck or unavoidable acts of nature. They are the predictable result of these intersecting forces. We've got the climate physics, amplified by climate change, yes, but that hits a system made incredibly vulnerable by decades of historical policy choices. The shift to exports, the neglect of local food systems, and compounded by modern economic fragility like debt and inflation.
So what does this all mean for you listening? I think the big message here is that the potential is there. The region has local knowledge, it has advanced forecasting tech, the policy ideas for resilience are known, but the ability to actually implement those long-term investments to make those transformative changes, it's constantly undermined by that deep-seated fragility, by the external debt burden we talked about, which has roots going way back past the SAPs, back into those colonial structures. And this leads to maybe the most provocative thought from the analysis, something to really chew on. It suggests that for these nations to genuinely invest in their own sustainable future, in their agriculture, their infrastructure, their people, they might first need to be freed from the historical debt burdens, debt accrued from poor colonial investments and later lending practices. The real solution, the research seems to imply, might actually be a kind of financial decolonization. That might need to happen before all the tech fixes, before climate-smart agriculture can truly take root and build lasting resilience. It's a challenging idea,